Welcome to Money Talks. I'm Cathy Yang, your intel on the Philippine markets and the economy. In the headlines, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas is looking to freeze more accounts linked to the anomalous flood control projects. Governor Eli Remolona assures the country's financial system remains sound.
So that does affect liquidity in general, but our banks are very, very liquid at this point. I think I can say that with confidence, no bank runs.
And we get behind the socio-behavioral reasons behind corruption with Professor Benito Bentihanki of De La Salle University joining us live. Policy shifts needed to address structural headwinds in the Philippines, says ASEAN Plus3 Macroeconomic Research Office. We speak with AMRO Principal Economist Dr. Jinho Choi, live from Singapore. And government work and classes in all levels canceled today in anticipation of intense rains brought on by severe tropical storm Oppo. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas is looking to freeze more accounts linked to the anomalous flood control projects. The BSP has so far frozen over 700 accounts amounting to more than 5 billion pesos. I spoke exclusively with Governor Eli Remolona at the Bangko Sentral headquarters in Manila. Here's an excerpt of my conversation with him.
8.7% in the beginning of...
In an exclusive interview on One News, Bangko Sentral Governor Eli Remolona expressed a deep shock at the extent of the flood control corruption scandal.
It was worse than we thought, but I think it will get better. This flood control scandal was as much of a shock to us as it was to you. But we're working hard to fix things.
What in particular shocked you most?
The scale of it, the amounts involved, we had no idea. We had no idea. I mean, you and I, we knew there was corruption all along, right? But not on this scale. Not on this scale.
And not on the scale that 1 billion pesos could be stuffed into luggages and brought to homes inside cars.
Yeah, and the sight of piles of cash on a table, that's kind of shocking, no? That I didn't know. This was all done in cash and in such amounts. So that is shocking.
The BSP has since issued a circular last September 19, limiting the value of large cash transactions per day to 500,000 pesos, or its equivalent.
We want it to make it more difficult for the contractors, for the guys involved in this flood control mess, to be able to take money out of the banks. We just realized that all these transactions are done in cash.
It's a move that has angered netizens and the public alike, calling it a hassle, especially for businesses and individuals with legitimate needs amounting to 500,000 pesos per day.
Alam namin yun. Kaya pwedeng kausapin yung bangko, sabihin mo kung bakit mo kailangan yung cash, and then the bank can allow cash. If you justify the use of cash, you should be able to get cash.
Could you give us justifications that would pass the metal?
Well, we understand that there are businesses that are really cash-based, and I think banks also know that. So the businessman can come to a bank and say, I need cash, more than 500,000 pesos, and this is why I need the cash, and the bank will understand that.
Remolona confirms the BSP has begun its inquiries with banks to find out how big sums ended up in the wrong hands. As it's been done in cash, might there be maybe an inquiry into how the financial system or maybe even banks had maybe had something to do about how the cash was sourced? I mean, what kind of inquiries are you now making within the financial system?
We're making a lot of inquiries. We're finding out all the big. We're trying to identify the big flows of cash throughout the financial systems, the unusually large flows of cash. But not just cash, any financial transaction that looks unusual, we're trying to analyze.
And what have you found so far? Is it coming more from the government financial institutions, more private, or a combination of both?
I think more from the government financial institutions. And that makes sense because it's government money, so it would go through the government financial institutions. So that's what you've seen so far.
While Remolona expects the BSP to freeze more assets in question, he assures the public the financial system is secure.
So we've frozen over 700 accounts so far. We're looking at more accounts to freeze. So that does affect liquidity in general. But our banks are very, very liquid at this point. I think I can say that with confidence. No bank runs.
The Monetary Board is due to decide on policy next on October 9. Until then, Remolona and the board will have to keep a close eye on how the investigation pans out. Catch the second part of my three-part interview with Governor Remolona here on Money Talks Monday, September 29, when we talk about the outlook on rates. For details on these stories, you may also visit Business World online. Policy shifts are needed to address structural headwinds besetting the Philippines, says the Singapore-based ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office. With us now for more is Dr. Jinho Choi, AMRO Deputy Group Head and Principal Economist and Mission Chief for the Philippines. Good to see you, Jinho. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Cathy. Thank you for inviting me today.
All right, so you and your team were just here in Manila earlier this month, spending 2.5 weeks conducting policy discussions with authorities, stakeholders, and you found that the Philippine economy continues to grow at a steady pace, though slower than the pre-COVID trend. So what is driving slower growth?
Yeah, thank you. So actually, this year's bit slower growth than last year is mainly due to the slower growth outturn in the first semester, along with a weaker export outlook due to these higher U.S. tariffs. But still, household consumption remains as a key driver, remaining firm based upon this strong labor markets, eased inflation, and steady remittances from overseas workers. But this investment and export still face higher uncertainty because of these U.S. high tariffs.
Well, you've come at an interesting time, Jinho, because you visited at a time of escalating political risk. As you know, an investigation on the anomalous government flood control projects has led to a freeze order on the assets and funds of those involved. And there have been protest rallies that have also taken place last Sunday. And folks I've spoken with on this program say foreign investors are in a wait and see. So to what extent are these developments likely to shift your preliminary assessment on the Philippines?
Yeah, based upon when I was in Manila, actually I was able to see a few protests in Quezon City. At the time, it was weekday, so it was not that large scale as we saw during last Sunday. But I think still at this moment it's a bit premature to assess the impact of this recent policy unrest. But so it is likely to materially affect our baseline forecast for now or disrupt financial markets because still it remains a bit isolated. But nevertheless, we cannot rule out the possibility that this scandal can be escalated into more prolonged social issues. In the case, you need to pay attention to the forthcoming public reaction to the government's follow-up measures, especially the findings from this investigation due to this newly established committee. So in terms of economic impact, I would say that the government's ongoing investigation may temporarily freeze investment planning and implementation that may slow also activity in the construction sector, which account for about 16% of GDP. That said, this government, if they can root out this scandal decisively and more effectively, then I'll be more positive. So it may become an opportunity for Philippines to improve the public spending efficiency through greater transparency and accountability, because this kind of fiscal efficiency has been a problem for many years in terms of accelerating this structural reform. So in that sense, if a government can handle this issue quite nicely, then it will help support growth potential and strengthen investor and sentiment for Philippines.
But that is quite conditional, of course. There are the structural challenges that you did list, and in particular, you did make a mention of the insufficient infrastructure development. So how much of a bigger risk is this now, Jin-Ho, with the president saying that there will be no new funds to be allotted for the flood control projects next year?
Yeah, it was really also surprising to me. Governor Ali mentioned that. So we had some sense that this public spending has not been well used for the plan as they did. But actually, we also assessed that in terms of quantity and quality of this infrastructure spending or the structure has been lagging behind compared to other peers in the region. Even though recently the government is escalating their spending on infrastructure, still is in terms of the international base metric is lagging behind. So in the near term, we still remain cautiously optimistic about the macro outlook. But this sort of the lack of this infrastructure spending or transportation infrastructure may be a bottleneck for accelerating this reform and inviting more investors and tourists. So definitely it's a really substantial factor to sustain the Philippines' long-term growth.
Are there any other levers for growth for next year if, let's say, there would be insufficient or there would be a lack of infrastructure development in 2026?
So in the near term, as I highlighted, so there's maybe some suspension in this private and public infrastructure project, but still, in terms of growth, the Philippines is relying on domestic consumption, 70% of GDP coming from this GDP. So private consumption. So it may not be this suspension, this private investment may not be substantial impact on dragging down the growth itself, but it may have a long-term implication. That's why I'm trying to highlight that this how to deal with this scandal from the government point of view is really critical for sustainable growth for the Philippines.
So what would compel AMRO to lower the Philippine growth target for this year and next? What would be the game changer?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the question. So even though I assess that Philippines has been relatively stable in terms of this trade shock, but now, so Philippines now 1/3 of this export to U.S. is from semiconductor, which is currently tariff exempted. But now U.S. government, they try to say that they may impose 100% tariff on this semiconductor. In that case, they may affect Philippines export more substantially. It can be a definitely important risk factor. Also, potentially, so in the inflation perspective, even though our baseline scenario is a bit mild and stable inflation, so depending on the Fed policy, if decide to keep their interest rate higher for longer, it will affect global financial market with more higher volatility. They may also affect peso, more depreciationary pressure. It will weaken the peso and then trigger imported inflation. Then also inflation can be triggered. That could be another bottleneck. Of course, as a perennial risk, local supply shock, and then this from this super typhoon, flood, and other natural disasters and geopolitical conflicts. Those factors can be a perennial risk for inflation factor.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your insights. Much appreciated. Jin-Ho Choi of AMRO, live from Singapore. Well, the government is planning to borrow over 430 billion pesos from the domestic market in the fourth quarter. According to the Treasury, the plan includes 260 billion pesos in Treasury bills and 175 billion in Treasury bonds from October to December. This borrowing plan is nearly 37% lower than the 690 billion set for the third quarter. It is also below what was actually raised in July to September. Auctions for T-bills will run weekly from September 29 to October 27, while only one T-bond auction is scheduled in December to account for the holiday season. And in weather, Opong has weakened into a severe tropical storm after making landfall in eastern Samar. As of 7 a.m., Opong was last spotted off the coast of Mandaon, Masbate, packing maximum winds of 110 kilometers per hour and gusts of up to 150. Pag-asa says the storm is expected to pass close to or over Romblon and Mindoro provinces within the day and exit the Philippine area of responsibility by Saturday afternoon or evening. Wind signal number 3 is up over parts of Luzon and Visayas, including Sorsogon, Masbate, and portions of Samar. Catanduanes and the rest of Camarines Sur, Camarines Norte, Quezon, and Metro Manila are under signal number 2. Several other areas in Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao remain under signal number 1. With this, Malacanang has suspended classes at all levels, as well as government office work in Metro Manila, Eastern Visayas, parts of Bicol, and Western Visayas. Suspensions also cover the provinces of Camarines and some areas in Calabarzon and Maropa. Meanwhile, several domestic flights have been canceled due to the storm. Full details flash now on your screens. You're watching Money Talks. Coming up, a lawmaker urges regulators to review rules in capital market. And we'll talk about corruption in government with Professor Cathy Yang of De La Salle University, Manila. Keep it here on One News. Welcome back to Money Talks. I'm Cathy Yang. Former DPWH Undersecretary Roberto Bernardo has admitted his part in the flood control scandal and implicated more personalities, including former Senate President Cheese Escudero and former Senators Nancy Binay and Bong Revilla. Bernardo appeared yesterday, Thursday, before the Senate Blue Ribbon Committee for the first time, where he expressed remorse for his wrongdoings. He then proceeded to drop names of politicians who allegedly received kickbacks from flood works.
Engineer Alcantara would tell me every time that he made deliveries of cash to Congressman Zaldico in compliance with his commitment to Congressman Zaldico. After inclusion of the projects in Dagaa, I delivered 20% of approximately 800 million or about 160 million to Maynard Ngu, which was meant for Senator Escudero. I relayed the 25% commitment to Engineer Alcantara and told him that Senator Revilla will appreciate additional contributions for his senatorial re-election bid. Engineer Alcantara collected 15% commitment or about 37 million, which was turned over to me and which I then delivered to Senator Binay at a house in Quezon City.
Escudero, Binay, and Revilla all denied the accusations leveled against them. They all vowed to cooperate with the ongoing probes. Meanwhile, Senator Rodante Marcoleta presented former Marines Orly Regala Guteza, who served the security detail to Acobico Party List Representative Zaldico. Guteza claimed that from December 2024 to August this year, he was tasked to deliver a different kind of trash to Co and former Speaker Martin Romualdez.
Tagabuhat lang ako ng malita ng basura. Ang ibig sabihin ng basura ay malita na may lamang pera. Ang bawat malita ay may lamang humigit kumulang 48 million pesos. Ang bawat malita ay may push-it na nakadikit na nakasaad kung magkano ang laman ng bawat malita. Pag tumayo po ako, yung isang malaking big na malita is kasing ganito ang sukat.
Yung pinakamalaki.
Opo. Tapos pag binuhat ko po yan, ang bigat yan is almost parang isang sakong bigas sa 50 kilos.
In a statement, Romualdez said the accusations against him are outright fabrications and very forced. In our continuing coverage on the anomalous government flood control programs, our next guest cites three mutually reinforcing forces that allow public corruption to persist in the Philippines. With us now for more is Benito Ben Tihanqui, Professor of Management and Organization at De La Salle University, Manila. Good to see you, Ben. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Cathy. Thanks for the opportunity.
So what have you found, Ben, using the institutional sociology on why public corruption appears to be so persistent in the Philippines?
Terrific question, Cathy. We can think of corruption as a house, and we ask ourselves why this house keeps standing, right? Well, it's standing on three major pillars. The first pillar, of course, are the rules and the enforcement of those rules. This is very important to make sure that people behave honestly and honor their duties, especially as public servants. The second pillar holding up the house of corruption is the beliefs and values of the officials themselves. This is the sense of duty. Our Constitution says that public service is a public trust, but it's an open question whether anyone believes that. And the third pillar, of course, are the attitudes and beliefs of the citizens themselves. If they see corruption as business as usual, or as we say, ganyan talaga, and look the other way, then the house of corruption remains standing.
Did you just say House of Corruption? It sounds like a Netflix movie or an upcoming one.
Soon to appear in your screen.
Yeah, one of the solutions you provided actually includes electing and appointing, and I wanted to get to that after discussing what one might contest that if none is done to dismantle the dynasties, and I've spoken to Professor Julay Tihanqui about this, then we'd all end up voting for the same personalities, Ben. So how do we get started today?
Well, the dynastic problem has been a long-running issue. I believe there's very little incentive among our legislators to actually pass a law, so that provision in the Constitution may not see reality soon. But the core principle is that of delicadeza, meaning whether when you're in an official position, whether you should do things that benefit you or avoid doing that. If we look at the issues facing us now in the flood control matter, not all of it is dynastic, honestly. Some of these are simply just allegations of behaviors of people who are just incentivized by the very high rewards for corruption and the very low probability of punishment. So it still goes back to whether we have the right rules and whether we enforce the rules until somebody gets jailed and actually punished. But in the long run, I believe curtailing familial relations among politicians would be a good thing, but it will not be enough.
And a tolerant citizenry wouldn't be good in that mix. As you mentioned, the reinforcing forces, how do we get them to act then, especially the younger generation, the Gen Zs and the millennials?
Well, we need to educate all citizens that we are in a Republican democracy, which means that, as the Constitution says, all government authority emanates from the people, right? But a lot of citizens really don't take this right very seriously. They think we're still in a feudal system where those in power are looked up to and the rest of us have to tolerate what they do. In fact, if you talk to citizens, they will always say, ganyan talaga, ano magagawa natin? So, but we're seeing some level of outrage, and rightly so. The question, of course, is will this outrage be sustained and converted into action? Because outrage per se never corrected institutional problems because they're short-lived and they don't really change behaviors in the long run. So the citizens have to really form themselves into a movement that is sustainable. Really monitor. For example, we see a lot of people being alleged and named in the congressional investigations. But the question always when I look at these investigations is how many will actually be convicted and actually be punished. So it's up to the citizens to monitor this until the right people are punished.
Does it always have to be taking it to the streets? What sort of an expression are we looking at, especially as we've already been empowered online?
Well, I believe a public protest is an important part of it because that's very visible. And as you know, when people see others speaking up and speaking out, it encourages others as well. But what I'm saying is that the public show of outrage is not sufficient. This has to be converted to actual vigilance in monitoring cases until they are delivered up to conviction, and all the way to elections when we choose only people who have a track record of fighting corruption. Because in the end, no matter how much we go to the streets, if the public keeps electing people without a clear track record against corruption, that pillar of the House will just remain standing.
Just as a final point, Ben, and I wanted to pick up on educating and empowering. Tell us then what types of corruption and harms are not so out there, evident and easily recognizable, but is very pervasive. How then should we keep from getting drawn in?
Well, the basic types of corruptions are really bribes, especially regulatory bribes for permits and so on. But what we're seeing also is the infrastructure type when we see that despite the growth of our economy, services to the public and infrastructure is not improving, then common sense should tell the public that they should demand more. They just take it for granted that bridges collapse, that roads are bad, that floods will enter their homes. And this is actually nonsense because we know that the government allocates resources for these. How come it's not improving? Simple mathematics should tell you that if there is an input, there should be an output, right? So if things are not improving, citizens should ask. They should file freedom of information inquiries. They should write their congressmen. They should write their mayors. May we know why this is not improving? So this is important that citizens do on a regular basis and not just during elections or not just during scandals as we are seeing now.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your insights, Ben. I much appreciate. Ben Tihanki of De La Salle University, Manila. And a look at the markets. U.S. markets have slid for the third straight session yesterday, Thursday, as a fresh batch of economic data sets and corporate news offered mixed outlook signals. The S&P 500 and the Nasdaq tumbled by 0.5%. The Dow fell by nearly 0.4%. As for U.S. futures, they're little changed in after-hours trading. The Dow is up by less than 0.1%, and both the S&P and the Nasdaq down by less than 0.1% each. Let's take a look at the Asian markets. They're falling on Friday after President Trump announced fresh tariffs on furniture, heavy trucks, and pharma products. South Korea's Kospi down 1.8%. Japan's Nikkei 225 slides by 0.2%, and Australia's ASX 200 tumbles by 0.1%. And a look at the Philippine markets on this final trading day. PSEI opening this Friday higher, 6,600.067. It is up about 0.4%, with the stock market slumping below 6100 on Thursday, the lowest since April 8th, as investor sentiment remained in corruption on public works, according to Philstocks Financial. The broader all-shares index fell by over 0.75%, with the local counters in the red, led by mining and oil. As for the Philippine peso, it opens today weaker, 58.28 to the dollar. The peso lost 63.9 centavos to breach the 58 mark, a level that it last reached on August 1. And a lawmaker wants the SEC and the PSC to review their rules on capital markets. Albay Representative Raymond Salceda filed House Resolution 263, urging regulators to allow subsidiaries of listed companies to issue and list preferred shares while ensuring transparency and investor protection. The resolution notes sectors like power, renewables, water, telecommunications, and infrastructure needed expanded financing options. The resolution also calls for safeguards such as consolidated group reporting and full disclosures to protect investors and preserve market integrity. That is it for Money Talks. I'm Cathy Yang. Catch us again Monday, 9:30 a.m. here on One News. Stay safe amid the typhoon. Have a great weekend ahead.